Welcome back to the 90-second online episode of Peacetime, hosted every Sunday morning by Peacepoint with myself, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, coming to you today from DIMC in Azusa, California. In the previous session, we looked at the Kuttadanta Sutta, and today we take a break from our usual scriptural theme by looking at a previous Sunday morning topic that some of the audience wanted to recap at their leisure online, which is the topic of meditation and mysticism. I estimate today's session will run to about an hour and 10 minutes, with a 30-minute break halfway through for some meditation. For me, the whole topic of mysticism is like revisiting a time in my student days which was quite influential to me, because it came to a time when I was just getting interested in meditation. Mysticism was one of the elective subjects in the third year of the psychology course which I was following for my first degree. Even in those days, the subject seemed to hold quite a lot of transformational promise for me, as well as being fascinating to find out that although there are many different religions in the world, which on the surface seem so different, but when Western scholars classified and categorized the mystical experiences reported in those different religions, beneath the surface of language and cultural disparity, they found many equivalences. Especially for modern Western societies, Europe, North America, or Australia, where you find different religions cheek by jowl as next-door neighbors in some cases, then the underlying message is one of interreligious harmony. So with a comparative understanding of mysticism, we are in a very strong position these days to be able to detect similarities where people who have already belonged to those religions for many centuries, maybe they didn't realize the similarities they shared with religions and traditions from other parts of the world. Historically speaking, in the task of collecting and categorizing mystical experiences, there are two major figures who have had a big influence on our whole perception of inner experiences of a mystical nature. The first is the American psychologist William James, elder brother of the more famous novelist Henry James. He is considered one of the fathers of psychology of religion as an academic subject. He started his own research with introspection and always worked in a very subjective way, comparing documents left in different religions. His most famous published work was the book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, written way back in 1902, when modern psychology wasn't even a subject yet. The second, a figure quite important too, who built on the work of William James, was someone called Frederick C. Happold, and back in 1963 he wrote a book called Mysticism, a Study and an Anthology. And from reading through the experiences of people who have had mystical experiences, they start to find similarities in the features of these experiences. You might think, well, this is all very interesting, but does it actually have anything to do with meditation? And am I going to become a mystic if I continue practicing meditation? Well, the reason why it is useful for meditators to have some idea about this subject is that if you recognize the characteristics of these mystical experiences, maybe you can get some insights into your own practice, because what many of the mystics are describing is actually quite similar to some of the sorts of experiences you touch upon in the course of a more successful meditation. But most of the examples which I'll be giving you from these two gentlemen are derived from people who never had any sort of meditation training. So they've just been walking along the road, and wham bam, they've had a road to Damascus mystical experience. So what are the features that identify an experience as something mystical? According to William James, the first feature is ineffability, which means that the experience is very hard to put into words. Secondly, there is something called a noetic quality, which these experiences seem to have, where they seem to communicate some sort of knowledge which is beyond your normal, everyday, mundane knowledge. The third thing is that they don't last very long. They are transient. A fourth thing is that there's an element of passivity in them, in that you don't actually have to do anything. They come upon you. So it's not like something which you have willed into being, but is something which happens to you. Fifth quality is that part of the experience seems to be a unity of opposites, where things that are normally considered opposites, or things which are normally considered separate from one another, become united in a sense of oneness. Sixthly, there's a sense in which, although they last only momentarily, they seem to do something rather strange with our sense of time. Last but not least, there's a sense of true ego. And I use the word ego here with the ligatured ash spelling because the usual spelling of ego tends to have rather negative connotations. Let's say as if you have come across a true sense of self as a result of your experience, as separate from your normal everyday self. So William James contributed the first 4 of these factors, and Happold contributed the last 3. So we'll look now at each of these qualities in turn, giving some examples, and also the sort of questions asked to verify if a person has had a mystical component to their own experiences, because that's the sort of thing which empirical psychologists do. So the first feature of mystical experience is the ineffability aspect. Is defined as the inability to capture the experience in ordinary language. Some people are skeptical about mystics because they say they've had a wonderful experience, but when they're asked to explain themselves, they find themselves at a loss for words. So other people tend to say, well, if you can't explain it properly, how am I supposed to believe you? The mystic's problem is not with putting words into a sentence, but it's finding the words to capture the experience at all. The sort of questions psychologists use to identify this feature of experience is to ask people, have you experienced something that you cannot put into words? Or do you feel as if you have been moved by a power beyond description? Or do you feel aware of more than you ever could describe? These are some of the telltale signs unique to such experiences. An example of this feature that comes from a professor of philosophy, Douglas Schrader, who started out from quite humble beginnings and had a mystical experience when he was young, while walking in the field somewhere in Kentucky. He had tried to describe his experience to others, but had failed dismally. He said, I tried desperately to make sense of the experience like a small boy trying on his father's clothes. Nothing seemed to fit. Many ideas and concepts that I expected to fit seemed totally inappropriate. So he couldn't find the words to explain the experience which he'd had. Sometimes we have the same difficulty when we come to evaluate our own meditation experiences. In the Dhamma meditation lineage, we have it a little easier than in some, because at least we're usually working with visual cues. You can imagine that if you're just working with feelings, how much harder it is to describe the difference between the feelings yesterday and the one you had today. At least if it's a picture experienced in your meditation, you have a bit more of a chance to describe it. Other people might be at a complete loss or just attempt to draw it, maybe the William Turners of the world. The second feature of mystical experience is noetic knowledge, because it has been noted that mystical experiences are unique in revealing and otherwise hidden or inaccessible knowledge. And again, this aspect of knowledge is something which is familiar to us from the study of meditation as well. If you were to try to find out whether people have had experiences with this noetic aspect, the sort of questions you would ask them is, have you sensed God or a greater being in the beauty of nature, presumably for the Walt Whitmans of the world? Knowing you were surrounded by a presence of some sort, or hearing God or an inner voice speak to you. So knowledge which is normally inaccessible becoming accessible to you by virtue of your mystical experience. An example of noetic knowledge which comes from William James himself is the statement that they are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect. They are illuminations full of significance and importance, all inarticulate though they may remain, and as a rule they carry with them a curious sense of authority for after time. So it may be a weird experience for you, but the strange thing is that you are entirely convinced by them. And although it may be a full year since you had such an experience, the details remain fresh in your memory, even though you might have completely forgotten everything else that happened that year. It's very strange that they have a sense of authority and clarity which doesn't seem to wear off with time. In meditation, we tend to accept that there are different levels of knowledge, some of which can be accessed by normal rational thinking, some of which are beyond the reach of conceptual thought. And hence we talk about 3 levels of knowledge: sense knowledge, hands-on knowledge, and this third, noetic knowledge, which in the context of meditation we would refer to as insight knowledge. Sense knowledge, or as it's called in Buddhism, Sutta Maya Panya, is probably most familiar to you as the sort of things perceived through your external senses, things you can see, hear, taste, smell, or touch. For example, you might learn in a textbook that fire is hot, and you might even be impressed by that detail. But it's simply academic knowledge. You could memorize it, maybe get a few points on an exam by remembering it, and you can pass on such knowledge to other people, but it may not be particularly convincing because, in effect, it's nothing more than parrot learning. The second sort of knowledge, which is a little bit more reliable but still dependent on external senses, is hands-on knowledge, known in Buddhism as Cinta Maya Panya, the knowledge coming from reflection. Maybe the experience of putting a hand into the fire, something you remember much more clearly than having learned about it in a textbook somewhere. No one needs to convince you now of how hot is hot. And the interesting thing about this sort of knowledge is that it is transferable to other situations. Hence, if you are a new graduate from college looking for work, they always ask for experience because it means that you can actually put into practice what you've learned in theory. In the old days, they only taught the first level in schools. These days, they're making their graduates more employable by having them take a sandwich course with placements so that students can actually put into practice what they've learned before they go out looking for employment. Even so, in school, they can't expect to teach you anything more than these 2 levels of knowledge, which is an improvement, but it still doesn't give you this noetic experience. Noetic quality, or as it's known in Buddhism, Bhavana Maya Panya, is limited to direct perception by the mind. And by working with the mind to make it more radiant or still, then you open it up to allow it to access these sorts of qualities of knowledge much more easily. So, deep understanding for meditation would fall into this category, and the interesting thing about this sort of knowledge is that it is transformative knowledge. You feel somehow changed by knowing something new. So it's not like saying, oh yeah, now I know anger is really bad. Yeah, I'm not going to be angry anymore. But touching upon that knowledge in meditation evaporates the anger from your repertoire in a way that it will never return again. It's unique in this sense, so it helps you overcome your personal faults and weaknesses at their root. So it's not simply a glimpse of something in theory, but it actually improves your character as a result of having accrued that knowledge. Quite powerful, and hence the stuff of mysticism. Third feature of mystical experience is transiency. So it comes and it goes. Mystical experiences may last only for a relatively short time. If you want to ask someone if they have had this aspect in their experience, you would ask them if they've had brief glimpses into the heart of things, or if they've had transient visions of the transcendental, or if they've had passing moments of divine revelation or deep insight. This is one of the temporal features of a mystical experience. To give an example, and this one is sourced from William James's book, it's actually from the experience of someone hiking in the Swiss Alps with a group of their friends. And obviously, as they were walking in nature, when one of the boys had a mystical experience as he was on the trail, so he was basically struck down by the magnitude and suddenness of the experience. So I quote, "I was in perfect health, so nothing was wrong with him. We were on our 6th day of tramping and in good health. I felt neither hunger nor thirst, and my state of mind was equally healthy. All at once I experienced a feeling of being raised above myself. The throb of emotion was so violent that I could barely tell the other boys to pass on and not wait for me. And then I sat down on a stone, unable to stand any longer, and my eyes overflowed with tears. The state of ecstasy may have lasted for 4 or 5 minutes, although it seemed at the time to last much longer. My comrades waited for me 10 minutes at the cross of Barin, but I took about 25 or 30 minutes to join them. So what seemed like 4 or 5 minutes was in fact half an hour. It was something like what is known as a peak experience, if you're familiar with the writings of Abraham Maslow, a state of elevated consciousness or euphoria which suddenly passes. So turning now to the fourth feature of a mystical experience, we come to the passivity factor. It's often said that mystical experiences happen to someone and they're beyond the range of human volition and control. If you were to ask someone about these aspects of a mystical experience, you might ask them if they feel overwhelmed by a sense of wonder, if they have been in a state of mystery outside their body, or if they have been grasped by a power beyond their control. And again, we hear about the experience in quite a mundane situation, like someone waiting at the side of a cricket pitch for their turn to bat. The thing happened one summer afternoon on the school cricket field while I was sitting on the grass waiting for my turn to bat. I was thinking about nothing in particular, merely enjoying the pleasures of midsummer idleness. Suddenly, and without warning, something invisible seemed to be drawn across the sky, transforming the world about me into a kind of tent of concentrated and enhanced significance. What had been merely an outside became an inside. The objective was somehow transformed into a completely subjective fact, which was experienced as mine, but on a level where the word had no meaning, for I was no longer the familiar ego. So the experience was something which comes upon the experiencer rather than something they've willed into existence. You might think, well, what's the point of doing meditation then if it's going to happen by itself? But as you can see in all these experiences, they always happen to a person when they're in a peaceful state of mind. So it's like you have to set the bait a bit by being in a happy and undisturbed state of mind first of all for these sort of things to come to you. So it's passive, but it only occurs when the conditions in the mind are relaxed and amenable. So we move on to the fifth quality of mystical experiences, which you can refer to as oneness or unity of opposites. This quality is often talked about in the mystical scriptures of various traditions, generally referring to the combination of things which are normally impossible to find together. For example, fire and water in the same place, or where the subject-object distinction has evaporated, meaning the observer has become one with what they perceive. In other places, we find references to non-duality, as it's sometimes called in Buddhism. So if you wanted to ask people if they've had this aspect of mystical experience, you'd ask them about whether they feel at one with the universe. So the normal separation between me here and rest of the universe there has somehow disappeared. Sensing unity in all things, like not feeling a separation between yourself and the next person, and feeling at one with all living beings, a sense of compassion perhaps, where their suffering is your suffering and their happiness is your happiness. Normally we don't feel like that. We feel their suffering is their concern, but for their happiness you want a piece of that for yourself. So an example of the oneness feature, which comes from Douglas W. Schrader again, is I surrendered to a warm, loving presence which so totally engulfed me that the me in it was no longer separate from the experience. Often in meditation it's the same sort of thing. We start out as me here, observing the object there, but later as the meditation becomes more subtle, you feel that you're actually not only with the object, but you actually are the object, as if there's no separation. You are one and the same as the object. You become indistinguishable from it, and the oneness feels inextricable. Moving on again to the second to last feature of mystical experiences, some people say that mystical experiences transcend time, almost as if time stands still during the moment that you're experiencing it. If you want to ask someone questions about this phenomena, you would ask if person experienced merging of the past, present, and future in a single moment, or lost their sense of time, place, and person, or whether they experience being conscious only of timelessness and eternity. An example of this from a much older source comes from the 11th century Christian monk called Meister Eckhart. So in his words, an exalted power of the soul, knows no yesterday or day before, no morrow or day after, for in eternity there is no yesterday or tomorrow. There is only a present now. The happenings of 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years to come, are there in the present, and in the antipodes, the same as here. So this is why people can lose track of time, like the boy on the alpine path. The experiencer seems to be absorbed into the moment, to the point where time passes by without them being aware of it. On a more workaday level, I'm sure many of you have experienced meditations which have gone well, somehow seeming to be only a fraction of the time which has actually elapsed. You might think, we already know that time flies when we're enjoying ourselves, but this is something more than that. Sometimes you're quite surprised by yourself that an hour has gone by so quickly, for example. For the final feature of mystical experiences, it's the true self or true ego. It is a feeling that one has encountered the true self, cosmic self, or something like that, which is beyond life and death, different from the mundane ego or selfishness. Does it sound like it has some parallels with meditation technique again? Well, there is a sense that what we normally consider to be us, like the physical manifestation that we normally see when we look in the mirror, is really only a very superficial aspect of ourselves. But to get beyond that, beyond what is merely appearances, even concerning yourself, is something quite difficult to achieve. What seems to happen with mystical experiences is that you touch on some part of yourself which we can recognize as being somehow much more significant than our mundane self. Of course, different religions have different interpretations of what exactly that might be. A great being, or even a sense of knowledge or grace, is expressed in different ways. In our own meditation tradition, sometimes it's expressed as terms of purer inner layers of ourself, dimensions of ourself which exist in a deeper level of purity or wisdom, but which we can have access to only when the mind is at that same level of subtlety. The sort of questions which you'd ask to find out if people had touched on this aspect of their mystical experiences might be asking things like whether they feel as if they've been absorbed within the divine or a greater being, or if they have ever felt that they were losing their everyday self into a greater being, or feeling their everyday self absorbed into the depths of being. An example of true ego from Happold is the statement, "In man there is another self, the true self, which is not affected by ordinary happenings, and which gives him a sense of identity through numerous bodily and mental transformations. It does not change in the slow changes of the organism, in the flux of sensations, in the dissipation of ideas, or in the fading of memories." This is why the memory of mystical experiences stays with you even when you've forgotten other aspects of your mundane life. So having tallied up all 7 features of mystical experiences before moving on to consider some of the implications of these, let's take a break halfway and settle ourselves for 30 minutes of meditation, which today is a recent recording of a meditation entitled Mind of a Mystic. If at this time you would like to find a comfortable sitting position for yourself as you listen to my guidance. So I'd like to invite you to surrender to the process of just letting go into the here and now, in order to work on relaxing and focusing the mind. So starting with your physical posture, you can arrange your legs in a position that is most comfortable for you. Setting your back and spine to be as straight as an arrow. Place your hands in a position of meditative equipoise, with the left hand on the bottom, right hand on top, and the index finger of your right hand touching against the thumb of your left hand. Take this time to settle in and relax. to make sure you're comfortable and that you won't be disturbed or need to disturb anyone else during your quiet time. So get yourself comfortable and make sure you can settle down to focus on relaxing and letting go. So allow yourself to take this time to turn inwardly and explore your potential for deep relaxation. Relaxation is the entryway to renewal and insight, and the foundation of meditative awareness. So let's start by taking a deep breath in and relaxing with the outgoing breath. Let your exhalation be long and slow, with each inhalation drawing your awareness closer to the present moment. And notice the growing sense of relaxation that is coming over you with each breath. And allow your body to breathe naturally, with no effort to control or change the breath. Let yourself simply be the observer. Notice your capacity to allow this moment to be just as it is, without adding anything to it and without taking anything away. And at this point we might make a scan down through each and every part of our body, releasing, relaxing, and letting go. Beginning with relaxing and letting go of any tension in the crown of our head, the forehead and temples, the muscles around the eyes, the muscles of the face, and the cheeks, relaxing the muscles of your face, letting your face be like that of a marble statue, relaxing the jaw, the lips, and the tongue, feeling the flow of relaxation in the absence of struggle, in the radiance of effortlessness, as embodied in the poise of your posture of your body. Relaxing the throat so that it becomes soft and open. You might like to let your head shift gently to the right and to the left, and feel how this relaxes the muscles of the neck. Continuing by relaxing the back of the head, the base of the skull, the back of the neck, both shoulders, the shoulder blades, down through the arms, relaxing the elbows, the wrists, the palms of your hands, your fingers and thumbs, and inside you the heart, the lungs, the rib cage, the organs of digestion, the abdomen, the diaphragm, the lower back, both hips, the backs of the thighs, the tops of the thighs, relaxing the knees, the calves, the shins, the ankles and the heels, the tops of the feet, right the way down to the soles of your feet and your toes. Then turning your attention to the relaxation of the mind, you can feel the flow of the breath passing into and out of your body, allowing yourself to relax further with each exhalation, entering more deeply into the present moment with each out-breath, letting go of thought of the past and of the future, and opening up to the infinite presence of this moment, entering into the heart of this timeless present, and invoking a quality of spacious awareness. For now, letting the linear, rational mind take a temporary vacation, while engaging instead with the feeling of presence, the direct intuition of who you are, engaging with our capacity to allow the moment to unfold in its own way, in its own time, allowing your awareness to be like a vast, open sky, where feelings, thoughts, and sensations are constantly changing in form and shape. You might persuade the mind caught up in the past or in the future to return decisively to the present moment, being present to the process of life unfolding moment by moment, where you are merely the witness, the observer, relaxed, surrendering to the present moment. And at a certain point when we feel comfortable within ourselves, we imagine our whole body to be nothing but an empty space or a hollow cavity, with no organs or tissues, muscles or bones. Alternatively, you might imagine your body to be like a transparent bubble, with nothing on the inside. But at this point you can remember back once again to the picture of the sun shining, or maybe a full moon, a star, or a diamond, or perhaps an object that you can feel rather than see. Whatever you've chosen, conjure it up in your mind. The object may be clear to you or it might be fuzzy. But for our purposes it doesn't really matter. We allow that object to float slowly downwards within the space of our body until it comes to rest somewhere around about the area of our diaphragm, at the deepest point of the breath. If our awareness wanders anywhere else, then we're going to bring it back to this point. If the inner object disappears, we can think of a new one. And as for the problem of there being an excess of thought in the mind, if you find that that is the case, then you may be able to reduce the number of thoughts simply by ignoring them, by starving them of attention. But if the number of thoughts in the mind is really too many simply to ignore, it may be necessary to return to our good friend the mantra, hearing the sound of the words Samma Arahang coming up from the center of our body, or from the center of that inner object, almost like a silent music, with the words Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, over and over again, lightly, gently and continuously, helping to keep our mind on track at the center, but also reducing the number of thoughts in the mind down to a manageable level, until we reach a point where the mind seems to have settled into silence, We maintain our mind with the utmost of gentleness, never rushing the process, never trying to force our hand, until eventually we'll reach a point where only silence reigns in the mind. So in this way we continue to maintain our attention on track at the center of the body, as we familiarize ourselves with adjusting the minimal lightness of touch needed to bring us to the sweet spot of our meditation, for a few more moments now in silence until we come to the appropriate time. So we continue to keep our mind gently on track at the center of the body. If the attention wanders, we bring it back to the center. If the object disappears, we can conjure up a new one. And if the object changes, then we follow it in its new form. Meanwhile, we do our best to keep the mind free of thought. And as the mind becomes more refined, then you will start to have access to more refined and subtle states of mind. Because the mind can only have access to states that are as subtle as the mind itself. In this respect, there are 7 ways in which our meditation resembles features of mystical experience. Firstly, meditation experience is often difficult to describe or to put into words. Meditation experience also has something called a noetic quality, where it seems to communicate some sort of knowledge which is beyond everyday waking life. Often meditation experiences are transient, and there's an element of passivity in them, in that they arise and disappear, seemingly independent of any effort which we might make to manufacture them. So they are something that seem to just happen to us. In meditation experience, we sometimes come across the combination of things we'd normally consider opposites, such as large mental objects being concealed inside smaller ones, or where there's a dissolving of the barriers that normally separate one thing from another, like the separation between ourselves and all other living beings. With meditation experience, often there's a distortion of our normal sense of time, as if during deep meditation we step outside time. And with meditation experience, there is a sense of touching upon a true sense of ourselves, as distinct from our normal everyday self. Of course, meditation is more about accumulating wisdom than reveling in weird and wonderful experiences. But following a meditation lineage does help give us a framework of meaning for unfamiliar inner experience, where even disconcerting experience helps to pave the way towards the transcendental. So for now, we continue to keep our mind on track, lightly and gently for a few more moments in silence, until we come to time for some loving kindness meditation. And as we continue to connect with the inner experience at our center, we can spread loving kindness in a way based on the 4 divine abidings. These 4 divine abidings can be referred to for short as love, compassion, joy, and peace. They impart the qualities of the divine to ordinary meditators who cultivate these qualities. So we allow our awareness to go deeper to our center, which is the source of all the divine abidings. The first divine abiding is metta, the divine abiding of love or loving kindness. So although the associated qualities are benevolence and goodwill, it is said that the main underlying element of loving kindness is empathy, that you are not impervious to the suffering of others, but also feel for them in their suffering, just as a parent might co-experience the suffering of a very young dependent child in their care. So we allow this sense of empathy to radiate outward, touching and blessing beings around us in all directions, with this deep feeling of loving kindness. Not just individuals we know or like, but all living beings without exception, in ever-widening circles around us. The second of the 4 divine abidings, karuna, is compassion. So not only do you feel the suffering of others, but also the urgency to relieve others of their suffering and restore them to happiness. Just as no sacrifice might be too great for a parent to alleviate the suffering of a child in their care. So we allow this sense of compassion to radiate outward, touching and blessing beings around us in all directions, with this deep feeling of compassion. Not just individuals we know or like, but all living beings without exception, in ever-widening circles around us. We radiate compassion simultaneously in all 6 directions, like an ever-expanding sphere of light, deeply connecting with this feeling of caring for others and wishing them freedom from all causes of suffering. Radiating this feeling of universal compassion in every direction, expanding from the center and blessing beings in all 6 directions. The third of the 4 divine abidings is mudita, or sympathetic joy. So although the associated qualities are congratulation and magnanimity, it is said that the main underlying element of sympathetic joy is being glad for the successes experienced by others. That you are not jealous or envious, but are glad for successes that are not your own. Just as a parent might be glad of the achievements their child has brought about at school or in the performing arts. So we allow this sense of sympathetic joy to radiate outward, touching and blessing beings around us in all directions, with this deep feeling of magnanimity. Not just individuals we know or like, but all living beings without exception, in ever-widening circles around us. The last of the 4 divine abidings is upekkha, or equanimity. So although the associated qualities are level-headedness, trust, and freedom from bias, it is said that the main underlying element is being there for another, being available and accessible for others if they should ever need us. Sometimes this quality is useful to give us the awareness that another person's problems are too big for us to handle alone. And sometimes it's trusting a person we have cared for to have the maturity to handle problems on their own without our interference. Just as a parent might have the backs of offspring who have already grown up and left home. So we allow this sense of equanimity and peace to radiate outward, touching and blessing beings around us in all directions, with this deep feeling of trust in others' goodness and integrity. Not just individuals we know or like, but all living beings without exception in ever-widening circles around us. So radiating all four divine abidings, love, compassion, joy and peace from our center, we extend the intention that all living beings dwell in love, compassion, joy and peace, now and forevermore. For the last few moments of our meditation together in silence. Sappa Buddhanupavena, Sappa Dhammanupavena, Sappa Sanghānupavena Sattha Soti Bhavantu Te. So if you'd like to come to the end of your meditation for today, you can gradually open your eyes again. If you feel at all uncomfortable, then slowly try changing back to a more comfortable position before gently finishing your practice. So to gently pick up where we left off in our consideration today of the features of mystical experience, we turn now to look at some of the implications of this type of mystical experiences. Some people wonder if the practice of meditation somehow leads in the same sort of direction as mystical experiences. And this question comes mostly from people who are worried that they're going to be struck down by visions when they are off on their travels somewhere or on their way to work. They might be worried that if they meditated more, it might attract weird mystical experiences. But concerning the possible link between mystical experiences and meditation, most of the weirdest experiences in the Happold and James books were reported by those with no experience of meditation. They tended to be people who have stumbled upon these experiences by mistake, and who have written them down, of course. Not too many of them had been intentionally cultivating a spiritual path, or even following a spiritual tradition. And in that sense, it's almost as if they were like amateurs because they were taken by surprise by these sorts of experiences. And in this estimation, I am not including Meister Eckhart, who was actually a Christian monk. Nonetheless, meditation somehow has a lot in common with mystical experiences. For it is almost like by following a meditation lineage, you have set a framework within which these things can happen to you safely, and in a way that you have them to some extent under control. Meditation gives structured access to mystical experience in several important ways. Firstly, it does help you to look beyond your superficial self, beyond the self which you see in the mirror, even if it's simply being aware of your personality or your character strengths and weaknesses, or on a more profound level, looking inward to your astral bodies or the yet more subtle bodies that lie within. Secondly, it helps you to go beyond your thoughts. Even that especially noetic knowledge is obviously out of the range of normal mundane thinking. So to go beyond that sort of thinking to something where you can touch on the noetic qualities, this is certainly where meditation helps to quieten down the mind and to make a space within which mystical experience can arise more meaningfully. Thirdly, if you are subject to illusions about the world, such as the world consisting of nothing more than material things, then meditation can sometimes loosen the hold these sort of illusions have over you, since most people do seem to sleepwalk through life even if they're not delusional. The majority are subject to quite a lot of illusions. Many of us have our roots in one or another of religious traditions, but sometimes they are nothing more than rites and rituals to us. On a personal level, we might overlook the deeper values in those religions. But given that all the faith traditions have a mystical aspect to them somewhere, whether it be the Sufi mysticism of Islam, or the ascetic traditions of Hinduism, or the mystical saints of Catholicism, or Tibetans who go off into caves and meditate in Buddhism, it helps perhaps to introduce that deeper aspect of religion to you in a more personal way, to help you to see connections between your own baby steps on the path of meditation and the amazing experiences of religious founders that are recorded in the scriptures or in the journals of people who have later been recognized as mystics. And even though mystical experience does come by itself, meditation does a lot to help set the conditions by which they can arise, instead of relying on chance. In fact, meditation is quite a good time saver for people who don't want to rely on random access to deeper experiences. Most assume mystical experiences would be a distinct rarity in the present day, especially in Western society. But from my own research in the UK, where I gave temple-going teenagers the opportunity to talk about their religious or spiritual experiences, it turned out that more than half had experienced something that counted as some sort of mystical experience. Mostly they were Buddhist teenagers participating in my research, but others were just kids the same age hanging around temples with no particular religious affiliation. Nonetheless, these teenagers were able to describe quite a lot of surprising experiences which they'd had at a young age. But it is definitely an advantage to have a structured tradition and discipline to guide your meditation to allow you to harness transcendental experience rather than letting it overwhelm you and turning you into some sort of recluse. I think meditation somehow tames the mystical experiences in a way that allows them to give meaning to your life rather than taking over your life. Some people wonder whether having a mystical experience can be considered the goal of meditation. Actually, the goal for meditation is not collecting weird and wonderful experiences, but rather to attain wisdom. And nowhere is this clearer than where people have mystical experiences outside the context of religious tradition, as if it were just an aspect of human psychology. But what meditation seems to do, and what the advantage of meditation seems to be, is that it helps people to somehow incorporate these experiences into something which is helpful to them as a character building process, rather than simply being something weird or possibly disturbing that happened to you in your life. Having funny experiences has never been the object of meditation, but the wisdom that comes from such experiences is something which practiced meditators find valuable. The question becomes how to derive wisdom from these mystical experiences, and often you have an advantage if you already are part of an established spiritual tradition. Another important concern people have about mystical experiences is their superficial resemblance to psychotic episodes or mental illness. I guess the practitioner is probably the best judge of that for themselves, but at the same time it is important to have a critical edge to your appreciation of mystical experiences, because people having dramatic psychotic episodes sometimes give mysticism a bad press. I think what William James and Happold did quite well was to describe the aspects of experiences from people who are reasonably sane and whose mystical experiences affected them in a positive way. Back in the day, psychoticism was all behind the closed doors of asylums. Nowadays, however, I think there is more widespread familiarity with patients on antipsychotics who have been reintegrated in society rather than being sectioned. So there is a wariness towards weird experiences, and often they are used as a basis to judge other people negatively. However, my objective this session in comparing between meditation and mysticism is to underline the importance of being on a path you trust. Given that there are experiences available to those who have a refined mind, but it's important to have a context for it, through which they can bring meaning to life. Psychotic episodes would be included in the phenomenon which we would call nasty surprises. So it is not our place to judge people by debating, does this person's hearing voices mean that they're a mystic, or does it mean that they're a crazy person? But for ourselves, if we reflect on our own experience to see what there has actually contributed to our own sense of meaning in life, I think that's a more interesting way of looking at these sorts of experiences. On a similar note, some people wonder if mystical experiences are comparable to drug-induced hallucinations. When I was in college in the 1980s, completing my first degree, one of my teachers, John H. Clarke, had written a book called A Map of Mental States, where he described the relationship between mystical states of mind and those of drug-induced states, as well as the experiences of normal psychology, expressing the overlaps as a sort of Venn diagram whereby mystical experiences, abnormal psychology, and drug states are estimated to have large areas of overlap. The other aspect of John Clarke's model is that he recognized that mystical experiences can come in both pleasant and dark variations. In this connection, there are plenty of examples of bad drug trips that are like mystical experiences gone wrong, and also people who mix up things by seeking out mystical experiences on steroids by buying an air ticket to Peru and taking ayahuasca. Some of the mind-bending effects can be quite terrifying, but since the experiencer is not in control of them, this is the most terrifying part. It ends up being like lighting fireworks in the brain rather than bringing meaning to life. This raises the important point that not all mystical experiences are pleasant ones, but at least where they are scary, they are meaningful to the experiencer and are on the way to somewhere more transcendental. St. John of the Cross gave an account which he wrote called The Dark Night of the Soul, which was fairly horrific, and so John H. Clarke mapped out two paths, pleasant and dark, which may lead eventually to some sort of enlightenment experience. One is the way through brightness, and the other is the way through the dark. I think most mainstream religious traditions encourage people to stay on the pathway that leads them through the light. But there may be some people who are more extraordinary, who can go on the dark side and come out unscathed. But in the meantime, you can imagine quite a lot of terrifying experiences which might waylay them before they ever get to enlightenment. So my best advice for budding practitioners is to avail yourself of a clear understanding of a spiritual pathway to keep yourself on the bright side. Because with a spiritual path, you need to be able to trust where you're putting your feet as you move ahead on the dark spiritual staircase in front of you. Often only when you take a step forward will the next rung of the ladder appear in front of you. And if you are really sort of lost without some sort of guideline and clear understanding of the practice that you're doing, then the results can be unpredictable. This is why it's good to practice within the framework of a tradition. Having a time-worn lineage helps to put people's minds at ease. The Dhamma tradition, with its meditation on light and stuff, it tends to encourage people to stay on the bright side anyway. It's very hard to do it wrongly. But there are forms of meditation which do have their blind spots, and where they recommend that you do the practice only with your teacher present, a bit like mesmerism. So if you are a discerning meditator, then do look out for things which leave room for misinterpretation, because really you want to be sure about what you're doing and have that confidence in it. I would say that this would be essential to a wholesome spiritual journey. As for the hair-raising spiritual trips, Perhaps you can leave those for the saints to deal with. But if you have such experiences within the context of a tradition, then at least you can see the connections with what the experience means. And I think it's very important that people have something that they can compare their experiences to, and to have a sense of where they are on a spiritual pathway, to have a spiritual map, as it were, to give some direction to their experiences. Otherwise, they can really become untethered. Another perspective about the overlaps of mystical experience is that some people wonder if dreams can be considered to be mystical experiences. Interestingly, neither James nor Happold included dreams in their mystical experiences. A lot of my teenagers thought they were, especially when the dreams turned out to be prophetic. Again, since many of the teenagers I surveyed had these prophetic dreams, they thought they fitted into the mystical category. Furthermore, there were experiences such as being visited by relatives who had passed on in some sort of lucid dream. And I'd say that they were changed by these dreams, so they woke up a different person from what they were when they went to sleep, even if it's simply from acknowledging that there's more to life than meets the eye, so their worldview was changed as a result. Another aspect, not so mystical but weird nonetheless, was that when some people were about to fall asleep, or they have woken up suddenly, and they found themselves in a state of altered consciousness. They might otherwise have been perfectly healthy, and they hadn't been taking any substances, but there seems to have been this disconnect that happened between their mind and their physical body. They found themselves stuck in a state where they were aware of this other spiritual presences around them. They may have been scared because they couldn't move. They were completely immobilized physically, but the mental state was aware, and so they think that it must have been under some sort of threat, a sort of liminal twilight state. To give some context to such experiences, which I think would be considered weird but not mystical, I think it's worth pointing out the very important difference between focusing internally and focusing externally. You might have heard me give talks on this subject before. If you focus externally, you can always get concentrated states, but there will be states that you are not in control of. With meditation in this tradition and most sorts of meditation within the context of Buddhism, one focuses internally in order to attain concentrated focus or one-pointedness of mind. If it is internal, you can stop or reset anytime you want, just by opening your eyes. However, if you feel like you're captivated by a point outside your body, if you're drawn into it in a way that you can't stop when you want to, then this is potentially dangerous. It falls into the same category as mesmerism. Similarly, if you fall asleep in a state of mind where you're not focused internally, and you happen to wake up in that state of not being in control of yourself, body and mind are somehow caught out of sync. This is if you're woken up with your awareness not fully within your own body, because what tends to happen when you dream, if you're not a particularly centered person, is that body and mind go off in different places. Your astral or dream body goes off and has its journey while you're asleep, and if you happen to wake up when the mind is not yet fully returned, because that dream body almost inhabits the same wavelength as disembodied spirits that have already passed away, your body feels paralyzed, although you are aware. As you wake up, you're able to see other things which are also in the spirit world. This is not really meditation per se. It is a trance or an altered state of mind, but not one that you're in control of. It's like a sort of interrupted dream. If you want to avoid getting caught up in this sort of weird experiences, the solution would be 10 items of homework, particularly to make sure you bring your attention back to the center of your body before you go to sleep. To make sure the first thing you do when you wake up is to center your mind, because otherwise sleep, especially for people whose mind is not particularly well centered anyway, can be quite a terrifying experience. Regular meditation, if it's internally focused meditation, would also help a person to avoid these sorts of twilight experience, because meditation trains you to center yourself, and being centered in your awareness even at the time you fall asleep, so that you don't end up waking up feeling disoriented. So although this waking paralysis is quite a weird experience, I would not count it as an experience with mystical learning potential. Especially after hearing about my mystical findings with youngsters, some people ask if teens or young people are particularly open to mystical experiences. Well, I know that there is a whole body of spiritual and religious experiences that were compiled into a database from the 1960s onwards by someone called Professor Alistair Hardy. He wrote 2 books on his findings, one called The Divine Flame and the other called The Spiritual Nature of Man, Study of Contemporary Religious Experience. It turns out that although Alistair Hardy passed away in 1985, additions are still being made to the database. More recently, some of the academic colleagues who did similar research as mine, but with Christian children, found that the age 13 to 15 is a time which is often a watershed for spiritual experience in general. It's an age when there seems to be an openness to all sorts of experience, and you can probably fill in most of the gaps for yourself, but included in this is the openness to spiritual experience. If young people have a positive experience of the transcendental during those formative years, often it stays with them for the rest of their life and affects them in a positive way. But adolescence seems to be a watershed time, after which they become more fossilized in their attitudes. Whatever impressions they've formed in their teenage years tends to stay with them for the rest of their life, either good or bad. There was some interesting research conducted with Christian children, for example, comparing those from Catholic and Protestant schools in Northern Ireland. Surprisingly, they found remarkable similarities, even though they were supposed to be on different sides of the barricades. So one final takeaway from today's session is advice on what to do if you have one of these mystical experiences. Generally, I would advise that we ought to be hesitant in this day and age to share our experiences too widely, because some people may take it the wrong way and judge you for it. I did co-write an article with Dr. Shreya Kulupana aimed at clinicians in the psychiatric profession, because sometimes, although religious faith can help recovery for people who are mentally ill, very few patients would dare to mention any interest at all in religion, because they know what the psychiatrist will immediately jump to the conclusion that, here we go again, we better up the dosage here, because this patient is starting to spout religion now, something must be wrong with them. Actually, it could have been their refuge if the psychiatrist knows the appropriate way to leverage it to help them regain their confidence or self-esteem. So it's a fine line, but one psychiatrist shared with me that they are actually under a lot of pressure to act quickly for the patient's health. And if a person presents with psychotic or schizophrenic symptoms, usually they have to come down very hard and decisively by administering some sort of strong medication. And often that can shake the patient out of their episode. But if, as a clinician, you don't have the right information at your immediate disposal, and you're not familiar with the patient's case history, you'll jump in and administer the medication anyway. Unfortunately, such medication is so strong that administered without justification, it may mess up that person's life the next 10 years until they wean themselves off the medication again. So having awareness of a patient's case history is very important for health professionals, so they can make a diagnosis accurately. Otherwise, they can make some tragic mistakes. I know people have been on medication for 10 years for the wrong reasons, simply because they happen to mention that they've seen a ghost. But I think the idea of mysticism is to see what you can learn from those experiences for yourself, rather than to go bragging about it to others, which would not generally be considered the sign of a mystic. So today we've been looking at meditation and mysticism. For my next live session online, which will, fingers crossed, be a week on Sunday morning, we'll move on to look at the Kalama Sutta, which is all about not believing things on hearsay. So for good measure, I'd like to remind viewers to keep the questions coming in about meditation or topics that you've learned in the lecture to the email address that you can see spelled out on the slide, and I will do my best to answer these on my next session. In the meantime, try to avoid recklessness or complacency, maintain a positive mood, speak only positive words, forgive others, extend good wishes to others, and meditate daily. Hopefully, as a result of today's session, you will have a clearer idea of the nature, but also the perils and pitfalls of mystical experiences, and how to give these a safer context through meditation. So that's all for today. Thanks for viewing. So long, folks, and stay safe.